network access. In this nugget, we talk about network access, and we start off by talking about perimeter networks, which is probably going to be somewhat review, but there's a couple of new things you'll see there as well. We'll also take a look at VPN protocols, such as L2TP, PPTP, and then a new version, which is called SSTP. Pretty cool, because it's very secure, and yet it's simple. We'll also take a look at network access policies, which are how we govern and determine who can connect, when they can connect, what methods they use to connect. And then we'll also take a look at network access protection, which is weird because it has the same acronym as network access policies. But network access protection, formerly known as quarantining, is a new feature of Windows Server 2008 that is much easier to configure than what we've had in the past, although it's still quite complex, I have to tell you. Then there's also enforcement, which is part of NAP, and this is where you can configure how NAP is applied depending upon whether you want to enforce it on DHCP or whether you want to do 802.1x or whatever it is that you want to do. A number of different ways of enforcing it, which we'll take a look here at the end. I gotta tell you, folks, I've really been blessed to be able to get into a lot of events and do some things that I never thought I'd be able to do, a lot of times related to photography. And although I'm not going to get into a big thing here on photography right now, I do want to share with you just a bit of fun that I was able to have last spring, where I was able to shoot a celebrity basketball tournament. And here I photographed one of the athletes there, which is who's Larry Fitzgerald, of course, with the Arizona Cardinals. And then you can't see him because his arm's blocking, but right behind him there would be Kurt Warner in number 13 there. Another one of my favorite athletes. So, I've really been blessed to be able to get into these things. And you might wonder, James, how do you get into this stuff? Do you just sneak in? Well, actually, sometimes yes. But in this particular case, I actually got authentication, which then authorized me to have access. That's the 3 A's. And we also have that in technology when it comes to things such as VPNs and being able to access networks or resources. And as we take a look at that, one of the things that we should review just real quick here is kind of, again, an overall mapping of access to your network and to how that takes place. Now, although I'm pretty sure you're already familiar with a lot of this, let's just quickly review this. First of all, we may have an untrusted environment or untrusted network, such as the internet, where maybe I've got a laptop user here. It could be my own user. It could be a hacker out here. And then they try to get into, ultimately, to my local area network, because this is where my file servers are going to be, my SQL servers, the web pages that the user might need to access, their intranet web page, for example. All those sorts of things might be there, of course. So how do they get there? Well, I want to make sure that only the appropriate people and computers can get into that. So what they'll do is, from the internet, they'll traverse it through their border network, and we haven't really mentioned that before, and it's not really an exam issue. However, sometimes Microsoft does refer to a border network. This would be the network that's directly adjacent to your firewall and the internet at large, and that would normally be the switches and routers constituent to your ISP. So your border network and your ISP are pretty well equivocal in that sense. And then you have, of course, your perimeter network. Now, what's interesting about the perimeter network is it's normally bound by 2 firewalls. It actually could be a single network device. There's certain ones that you can use, but it may also be 2 in a logical diagram like this, and it may also be 2 in a physical layout here as well. In my perimeter network, of course, I have certain types of servers that I may want to be publicly available, and I just drew in one server here, but there could be many of them. There could be VPN servers. There could be one or more www servers. There could be one or more MX servers, DNS servers, whatever else you might need in your perimeter network. Anything that's in the perimeter is generally something you want the internet public to be able to access, with some small exception, of course, to VPN. You don't want everybody on the internet accessing your VPN, but that's kind of reserved there for your own employees or partners who want to access your network ultimately. Now also, these firewalls here, these can be a couple of different types. One of the types that they might be is a simple NAT device, and that's normally going to be on this side actually. A NAT device. And this is a network address translation, where on my local area network, maybe I got a client with an IP address of 10.10.9.1, and then on the internet, that's not going to route, because this IP address is no good on the internet. So the NAT device, what it can do is it will keep track of my private address on my local area network here, and then it will associate that with a random port number. So it'll see 10.10.9.1, and then it'll assign a random port of, let's just say, I don't know, 6,000. and then it'll send out my request to the internet where maybe I'm trying to access a web page. And when the response from the web page and the content comes back through, the NAT device will then identify this port number that's included in that, because when the response comes back, it'll include in it this port number. The NAT device looks at its NAT table and it says, oh, I know who that belongs to. That belongs to this IP address, and that's how it knows how to send the proper content to that specific host instead of just any other host out here on my own local area network. So that's one of the functions of your firewall there. And firewall is kind of a broad term. There's many different ways of implementing it. One is just what I showed you there, NAT. A lot of different products provide NAT service. In fact, even those home Linksys, wireless area networks, devices that also have ports in them for switches and things. A lot of times even those home devices will provide that type of a service. And in fact, I think they all do nowadays. The other thing that you can have there is some kind of a software or an application level or application layer firewall. And a good example of this would be something like ISA Server. ISA Server. Although, interestingly enough, you may not be aware of this, ISA Server, at the time of this recording, is actually not compatible with Windows Server 2008, but it is an excellent product. So here, you might have to install a Windows Server 2003 server running ISA Server. But it would give you inbound and outbound stateful inspection, where it would do things such as identify where the traffic is headed. It'll also do some potentially additional inspection of the packets. You may need to get other products that would do this as well. These are also known as intrusion detection systems, where it can look inside the packets to see if there's something that's malformed or that is symptomatic of malicious traffic that might be trying to come back through. For example, traffic that might be trying to disguise itself as actually coming from someplace else, or manipulating the contents of a certain packet in order to be able to, again, fool the network into allowing it to come on in. So ISA Server, other types of intrusion detection systems, or IDS systems, all perform that type of a function for us. And of course, the tricky part of all of this is how your client out here on the internet, for example, is able to access this local area network down here. By the way, I didn't mention all of this, but I got a number of different terms that describe this local area network here. That's because Microsoft has used just about all of these, and more probably, in a number of different documentations and things. So it may be called a protected network, or a secured network, or a private network, or an intranet. The flavor of the month is generally intranet, for what they've decided to call it lately, but who knows if they'll change their mind again. Also, with the perimeter network, they've changed that term quite a lot. They've called it a DMZ, or a demilitarized zone, in the past, as well as a screened subnet. We seem to see that a lot more in Windows Server 2003 documentation. Now the flavor of the month is perimeter network. Hopefully they'll stick with that for a while so we don't get more confused. Now, how do they get this access, though? Well, normally this client out here, maybe it's a legitimate user of mine, wants to access this LAN down here. Normally I can authenticate them using a VPN of some kind, and it may authenticate that user's credentials or the computer account, or both. So it could do a lot of different kinds of authentication. There's multiple different ways you can go with VPNs. Now, in other nuggets, other series that we have addressing Windows Server 2008, we talk a lot more about the next finished steps for configuring VPNs and network access protection, or NAP, and the like. Here we're kind of looking at the high level of how this might all be formatted and strategized here. We'll also take a look here in this particular nugget in some topics about the VPN protocols that you'll be using, as I mentioned earlier. And we'll also take a look at some of the main functions of network access protection. Now, one of the simplest and most basic methods for creating a VPN is the point-to-point tunneling protocol, or PPTP. One of the advantages of this is, of course, that it's very simple to configure. Of all the VPN types, this is probably the simplest. And it is actually fairly secure. It kind of has taken some knocks in the past for different exploits that have been run up against it, but in its current version, the way it appears, those security holes have pretty well been plugged, and someone can always come up with something new, but right now, it is actually pretty secure. And I would probably configure PPTP if I needed a real quick one-off VPN solution. I just learned that we have to set up a branch office in a new location. It's a small location, but we need to have some people being able to virtual private network back into my main hub office. And so I'm going to quickly set up a PPTP, at least until I come up with some other solution, come up with a certificate authority so I can use L2TP or some other more secure method. It's actually going to be pretty good for a real quick, 30-minute setup of a virtual private network. The other thing about it, though, is it does only authenticate the user. So you do have to have the appropriate credentials, but this might be the best solution if you suspect that you might have users connecting to your network using multiple computers that might not belong to them. For example, maybe they're visiting other companies and they're sitting down at their kiosks and they're making a VPN connection to us from a kiosk machine that we don't own. Well, that would be okay because there's no need for me to authenticate that computer. I really only want to make sure that they have the proper credentials. In other contexts, you may want to make sure that only certain computers can access your network, and that is inherently more secure because you have more control over your own computers because you know how they've been patched, if they've been updated, what kind of virus definitions they have, and the like. Also, PPTP does pose some possible NAT problems or network address translation problems. This is largely mitigated, however, with Windows Server 2003, Windows Server 2008, but in earlier versions of Windows there were some possible network address translation problems where it was not able to perform that function properly, and your connection kind of fell into a dead end on the other side of the connection. Another kind of protocol that we could use would be Layer 2 Tunneling Protocol, or L2TP. This is probably generally regarded as a more secure method for VPN, but it's also a little bit more complex because you're going to need things such as a certificate authority to be able to make this work. But because of its ability to use certificates to authenticate both the user and the computer, then you're going to be able to have a little bit more secure connection, and you're probably also going to be able to accept connections only from not completely trusted computers, but let's just say more trusted computers because they're not completely outside of your purview. Also, with L2TP, it does encrypt the data. Now, that's one characteristic of VPNs is that they have an encrypted tunnel, which makes it impossible to see what's going on inside of that tunnel. But in addition, with L2TP, the data itself is also encrypted inside of the tunnel. Also, this has data origin authentication, which is going to make things like man-in-the-middle attacks very difficult, if not impossible, to perform, because each of the packets is authenticated as having come from the specific origin that you identify. And then there's also something called NAT traversal, or NAT-T. And you'll need this in order to be able to allow NAT to pass on through. In order to do that, you'll also need to open up UDP port 4500 on your firewall. Now, with Windows Server 2008 and Windows Vista, we can now use something called Secure Socket Tunneling Protocol, or SSTP. And again, that's only with these operating systems, and probably also compatible with the upcoming Windows version 7, or whatever they're going to finally name that, and any other iterations of Windows Server 2008. But what we have here is an SSL encrypted tunnel that's created for the VPN. And if you already have HTTPS access for a web page, so maybe you've got e-commerce going on or something like that, or you have a web page that users need to log into using SSL, well, you probably already have the port that's necessary to allow that open, which is port 443. Now, because of this, you don't have to open up any additional ports and make your firewall look like Swiss cheese, as we call it, because it has too many holes in it. It's got so many ports that are open. One thing I do want to point out, just as a quick side note, by the way, is that there is a document up for you up on nuggetlab.com, not directly a part of this exam, but I do want to make it available to you, and it identifies common ports that you'll have to have open on your firewall for things such as virtual private networking, like like L2TP and PPTP. They require additional ports to be open, and other kinds of common access that you might need, such as for DNS, for Active Directory services if you're providing those, and so forth. But that's just up there as an FYI. And then you'll also have SSL tunneled before the credentials are sent. And what's good about that is that it makes it virtually impossible for someone to be able to intercept that network traffic and make sense out of the credentials that the user has sent along, because they're encapsulated in that SSL tunnel and it can't really be opened. Also, it does support wide authentication protocols such as the Extensible Authentication Protocol, or also known as EAP or EAP. It also supports ETLS, which is Transport Layer Security, or Password Extensible Authentication Protocol, or PEEP TLS, or MSCHAP, which is the Microsoft Challenge Handshake Authentication Protocol version 2. Alright, now what I'm going to do here is I've actually made a connection to one of my other servers on this network, which is my actual company server, which is accusource.local instead of nuggetlab.com. The reason why I've done that is because I kind of already need to set up a VPN here anyway. I don't travel as much as I used to, but sometimes I still travel on the road, and I might need to make a VPN connection to my home servers or my home network here. So what I've done is I've added the network policy and access services as a role to Server Manager. Now this is a little bit of a change in terms because in the past Microsoft has called this type of thing a number of different terms, and I won't go into all of that, but right now it's called Network Policy and Access Services. Notice that the service is stopped right now because I haven't done anything with it. So what I would need to do is to configure routing and remote access. So I'll right click here, and then I'll get a right click that I can set up, configure, and enable routing and remote access. That part of it's kind of similar to Windows Server 2000. Once that gets started, it launches a little wizard, which of course we just next passed the first item. And then from this point, some of it looks very similar if you've run this in Windows Server 2000 in the past. So what I could do is to make it a remote access server, which is going to allow dial-up or VPN. The only problem with using that default option there is that it also would require 2 network cards, and it would require this server to be more of a border router type of a role, similar to what ISA server would do, except that this would be significantly dumbed down from what ISA server is capable of. So the only other thing that's really practical for our purposes would be to do a custom configuration. And again, the only reason why I'm choosing custom configuration is because since I don't have 2 interfaces on 2 separate networks to work with, like I would in most production networks, then that one would not be practical. But otherwise, I would choose it. Here, I'm going to choose a custom configuration and say that I only want VPN access, because the first option that we saw in the earlier dialog box would also include things such as LAN routing, and that's not my objective here. So I'm just going to choose VPN access, and then I'm going to go ahead and finish this wizard. Now, once you finish the wizard, you'll now have ports that you can make available, and there should be 128 each of L2TP, PPTP, and then SSTP available. And again, the SSTP is the new one. And they all basically connect in mostly the same way from the client side of things. Here, let's just go ahead and take a look. Well, and by the way, one thing I recommend that you do is you either connect to yourself from the same computer where you've configured RRAS. Sometimes I call it RAS, sometimes I call it RRAS. This just relates to terms that Microsoft has used in the past. But I would make a connection immediately on that same computer. That way, if I connect successfully, I know that I've configured it properly. Then if I connect from elsewhere, like across a router or some other network location, and I fail in making the connection, then I know that I haven't opened up the appropriate firewall ports or something like that. But I'm going to go ahead now and set up a connection or network right here. And I want to connect to a workplace, which is another way of saying using a VPN connection. And then I say I want to use my VPN, or I could dial in directly. We don't do that very often anymore because that would be more like for, modem connections. Rarely do you see that anymore, although they still exist. And then here I would enter in the internet address. Now I would have to enter in a known IP address, or I would have to enter in a name if I'm on an internet connection, a name that's resolvable on the internet to my my VPN server. In this case, I'm just going to enter in the name of it, CDC1. Actually, I'll enter in my IP address, 10.10.10.5. How about that? And I'm going to use, how about the sexy new SSTP connection? So I'll make this as SSTP VPN connection. You can use a smart card. That's pretty cool. You can also allow other people to use this connection. I'm not going to really do that right now. Or you can say, don't connect now, just set it up so that I can connect later. I'm okay with connecting now, so I'll go ahead and enter in credentials. Once I've entered in credentials here, and then clicked on connect, you'll see that I am making a connection. So I'm going to pause while I enter those in, and then I'll resume when the connection starts. And I entered in the credentials, and now it's verifying my username and password. And once it gets to registering, normally you're going to connect successfully if it says registering. I just found that by experience. And then once that's completed, we now see that I have a connection to my SSTP VPN. I can view the status and confirm that I am sending and receiving traffic, and I can disconnect whenever I'm done. Now, before we move into NAP, let's first talk about network access policies. And you might be looking at this and you say, well, isn't that NAP? Network access policies, NAP, right? No. In another attempt to baffle us endlessly, Microsoft has called two different things with the same acronym. So a network access policy is a totally different thing than NAP, which we'll be talking about next after this particular topic. What we have here is very granular connection rules. We want to specifically identify who can connect to my network. They might even have proper credentials. They might be using one of my own computers. They might be doing everything just right, but I might still not want them to connect for some reason or another. Or I might want certain parameters to be built around that connection. For example, I might say I only want them to use, I don't know, PPTP instead of L2TP. I might say I only want them to be able to use PEEP instead of EAP or some other kind of an authentication request. Or I might want whatever the connection or other authentication is that I want them to use. And then there is the other NAP, which is Network Access Protection. And again, we'll talk about that coming up. But I can set up certain parameters around that in terms of things such as the remediation, which is how I can fix certain computers that don't comply with certain requirements that I have. So here what I've done is I've gone to back into the network policy and access services. I have to give Microsoft some credit here. I criticize them enough, I got to give them credit too. This is a lot easier to configure than it ever was under previous versions of Windows Server. This is pretty cool, in fact. If you go into the connection request policies, we'll see that this is a policy that is enabled, and it gives us kind of a summary down here below about what it all is. But if we double click on it, that'll take us right to it. This is a policy that is enabled, and it simply says that we want to govern the type of connection to a VPN server. Now, I changed that. Before it was unspecified. It wouldn't matter in our context. But this is the Windows authentication for all users item, and the condition here says I want to allow anybody to connect at any time. So I could double click on this, and it shows you can see that everybody's permitted at any time. Now, another thing that I could do with this is I could say I only want people to be able to connect during business hours, and then I would deny all of this, and I would allow only, can't really quite see this, but let's say whatever that is, 7 o'clock, I think that is, to let's say 6 o'clock, something like that. So permitted. And then if someone tries to dial in during that hour on Sunday, then they would be denied if I were to click OK right now. So then you can very specifically govern when people can make connections, for example. And then under the settings, I can specify which authentication methods I want to allow. By default, in this particular policy, whatever setting the user has configured in their dial-up connection type is going to be allowed, whether they've got msChap or PAP or whatever it is, whatever else it is. But you can also override those here if you wanted to as well. Now, I want to show you this. There are also pre-configured policies that are already set up. This is the connection request policies. These are network policies that we have here, and this is going to be one that's going to stop us cold, and let me show you why. If I go to my users, I think I have a trainer account right here. Then if I go to the dial-in item, notice that it says control access through NPS network policy. Now, I cheated a little bit because previously when I'd made a successful VPN connection, this was already set up to allow access. Okay, so I had set it up that way. By default, what happens is when you create a new account, it's going to have this setting down here, the control access through NPS network policy. So, given that being the case, if I were to try to make a connection again, like I did earlier, let's try it now. For our connect to a network, see, I've already got this connection established. Now, if I try to connect with this connection, well, we're going to see what's going to happen is it's not going to allow me. Failed to connect. Why? Well, let's go back and look again. Because down here under network policies, notice the red X. This says that I cannot connect to the RAS server. Okay, and it says Microsoft Routing and Remote Access Server, which is just a mouthful. I still just call it RAS for short. Okay, what this is doing is it's denying access. If I meet any of these conditions, which is a Microsoft client basically, then I'm going to be denied a connection. So if I really want to turn on remote access, what I have to do is to grant access here. And then you can't really see the OK button down there because of space, but now I'll click on OK. And now once I've done that, notice I get a green checkbox now. Now I'm going to try to make that same connection, connect to a network, make the same connection here. And now what we're going to see is with these credentials, I'll be able to connect. And indeed, you see that I'm now successfully connected. Okay, so that's all because of, and let me disconnect this before I forget, that's all because of that particular item, those remote access policies. Okay, so as I go back over here, okay, that's because I enabled this particular item. Now you can be very specific with this, and I was talking earlier about how Microsoft has made this much, much easier to understand than it was in the past. This all pretty well explains itself. Under conditions, for example, I could add in another condition, and I could say I only want people that are members of specific groups to be able to connect, or machine groups to be able to connect, or user groups. You know, all different kinds of things that you can configure in this. What kind of protocol they're using, what IP addresses. Maybe I only want people from a specific IP address range to be able to make a connection. So you can see all different kinds of conditions that I can configure in there. I can also say for authentication, they must be able to comply with at least one of these items that I have selected here, or a smart card, or something like this. And if I don't see the authentication method that I want, I can click on Add and add something else in here as well. And we talked about the fact that these are also supported here. Then as I move on over here to settings, we can see under NAP enforcement, we see that if they successfully comply with my network access protection for this policy, normally we're going to allow full network access. But we could say only allow full network access for a limited time. Why would I want to do that? Well, maybe I've got wireless clients that are on the network, or maybe I have just dial-up clients that are on the network, and I don't want them to hold open connections indefinitely. So that might be one idea. I might want to allow only limited access, or I might want to configure a remediation server. Okay. Normally what happens is it's going to automatically remediate my client computers. And we talk about that coming up here shortly. But this is simply going to be the idea where it will fix computers that don't have the updates that they need and give us what we need in case they're not meeting those requirements. So anyway, these are the remote access policies that we want to be able to configure and understand. And you want to make sure that these are properly set up so that your users can connect. Now, all of that information about how to make a VPN connection will do this for you. It will make a secure connection between your server and the rest of your network and that client that's trying to make the connection. And it basically makes them the same as if they had a really long network cable that could be thousands of miles long and plugged directly into your switch or router in your corporate network. Okay, so that's the effect of what they're able to get. The only other difference is they're somewhat limited by the speed of their internet connection, but otherwise they're privileged, just as privileged as if they were sitting in a cubicle in your office. Now, this does also present some problems, however, because this is not bulletproof in terms of security. I mean, it's pretty close in terms of the authentication and all of that, but there's still ways for malware to enter in your protected, so to speak, network. You might say, well, I set up SSTP and we thought that was the best way to go, and we didn't open up any extra firewall ports, and we know it's a very secure way of making a connection, and yet somehow we're still getting, viruses and Trojan horses and stuff like that. How's this happening? Well, a few different ways. Number one, it could be that code is being executed on the computer that is connecting to the system. For example, even within your corporate network, and regardless of VPNs, people could have received an email. Maybe it's a malicious spam of some type, and it has a link that they click on. When they click on the link, it takes them to a malicious web page, which then downloads some kind of a malicious program onto their computer. So all of those things could happen. And these could all be happening separately as well. There could be something embedded in the email itself, which automatically launches itself like a worm or something, and then sends email out to all of the people in their distribution lists and their address book. They could just innocently go to a web page that they did not know had malicious content. They could simply just download something that they thought was supposed to be a speed optimizer for their Windows computer. It turns out that it's malicious software of some kind or spyware. And people also bring in these USB flash drives, and they're kind of ubiquitous, and I'm sure you've seen those now. Sometimes they're called thumb drives. And they're really easy ways to transport gigabytes of data in your pocket from one computer to the next, or to go from your home computer to your work computer to wherever else it is that you're going. So they're very useful that way, but somebody could have picked up a virus on their home computer, and then it could have been transferred to that UFD. Then they stick it in their pocket, go to work, plug it into a work computer. Now, the work computer has the virus too, thank you very little. And this is a big issue in a lot of environments. In fact, there's a nuclear laboratory that I've been at many, many times in the past few years where I've done some consulting and some training and stuff. And at the nuclear labs there, okay, so it's Los Alamos Nuclear Labs. Anyway, at Los Alamos, I had always told a story that I thought was true, but it turns out it wasn't quite true, and I'll tell you what that is. They took their USB ports on their computers, and they filled it full of tub and tile caulk. so that people couldn't plug in these UFD devices. And I had told that, for a few months or a couple of years even, and I thought that was always the case. But last time I was there, I found out that I was completely wrong. I'm sorry about that. Didn't mean to tell any lies. It turns out what they were actually using was not tub and tile caulk. It was JB Weld. So they weren't plugging them up. It was just with different stuff than I thought. If you don't know what JB Weld is, it's that stuff that you can use it's a metallic paste that you can use to patch radiators. So they were pretty darn sure that nobody was going to stick those things in there. Anyway, that's one of the reasons why. Because malicious code could get executed. Also, you may have laptops. These could be your own users or guests that are visiting your company. But let's say they have a secure laptop. You've updated the virus definitions and things like that. But they're out of the office for a few weeks, and in the meantime, there's been new virus definitions and new threats. Well, while they're out of the office, they connect maybe to a public Wi-Fi, and somebody else on that public Wi-Fi is a skilled hacker who's able to plant some kind of spyware or virus on their system. So that's a problem. Now when they plug back into your network after returning for a few weeks, they have that malicious software which can then invade your network. Could be a guest from another company. Maybe they don't have the same security policies that we do, or they use legacy software like Windows 98, heaven forbid, or something like that, which is very difficult, if not impossible, to really secure. So when they're connected to my company now on my own LAN, I'm going to get infected. Also, it could be a home user, etc. But they took their laptop to their house while they were at their home. Their kids played a game on it and downloaded some kind of virus, that sort of thing. You get the idea. Also, it could be home access, and by that I mean people like telecommuters. Maybe they live a great distance from the office and rarely, if ever, come into the office. So they always connect using their home PC, maybe even over a secure VPN. Even though that connection is secure, they're also browsing on the internet and they're going to risky websites. Maybe websites that they would never visit while they were at work sitting in a cubicle. But anyway, on those risky websites, it downloads some malicious code. It gets executed on their computer. It transmits across the wire to their headquarters office. And so again, you could get malicious software that way. Also, just guess, might be somebody from another company that comes into your network. Like I said before, other companies that don't have the same kinds of protections in place that you would. So because of all of those factors, this method here that we talked about early in our talk here is not completely secure anymore. I mean, it never really was, but because of some weaknesses where we could have somebody VPN in and then still transmit all their viruses onto my network, Microsoft came up with some other methods. They used to call this quarantine, and they had kind of a proprietary method almost that they used to configure it. It was a huge, huge white paper, which was very complex and difficult to implement. But now what they've done is they've kind of built that whole thing into Windows Server 2008, and they call it Network Access Protection. And what this does is network access protection adds a strong layer of protection to what would otherwise be loopholes in your security plan. And the basic idea behind this is that the clients must meet what we call health state requirements in order to be able to make the connection all the way into my intranet. So now when they make a connection, maybe they've been out of the office for a while and they don't have the latest virus definitions on their antivirus product. Now when they make a connection with network access protection, it can see whether or not they've got the latest version. And if they don't, then they can be, quarantined, so to speak. That's the old term that Microsoft used. But now what can happen is they can go to a remediation server, which can then allow them to download those antivirus updates, definitions, and then once they've been updated, then they'll continue on to connect to my normal intranet. It may also require that they have other things in place. It may require that they have the firewall up on that client computer. It might require that they have the latest malware or the latest Microsoft security updates. All those sorts of things can be part of what we call the health state. Also, any unhealthy clients, like I said before, you can either log those. And normally we don't do that on a long-term basis, but you might do that on the first parts of this as you're starting to explore it to see if you have clients that connect to your network that are out of date. And then what you can also do, and this is probably what's going to be happening more in production, is you would remediate them. And again, that's where they can download updates from a WSUS server, for example, or antivirus definitions from a server that handles those definitions. Now let's take a look at how NAP might work, and there's virtually limitless ways of configuring this and fiddling with this and making it work. And if I were to demonstrate all of this, I'd have to have about 7 servers plus clients. So it's quite involved in terms of the overall setup and configuration. And when you actually decide to implement this in your network, you're going to have to take quite a lot of time to plan this and configure the hardware and configure the software and everything that you need to have. But here's how this might work for our purposes. In fact, for the 70-647 exam purposes, the main thing you really just need to know is that a NAP solution will be able to prevent clients like this out here from being able to transmit malware into your restricted network. Okay, that's really just about all there is to it. But let's go into a little bit more detail than that, though. Here I have my NAP client, and this could be a Windows XP Service Pack 3, Windows Server 2008, or Windows Vista computer. And they all have an agent available on them that will be able to interoperate with the entire NAP process. So they make a connection to my VPN server. Now, the VPN server initially does the same thing it always does. It checks with my domain controller. It says, hey, is this user's credentials legitimate? And this is my Nugget Lab Active Directory and DNS server. And if those credentials are legitimate, then, of course, I'll be able to process through the rest of this stuff, which I'll talk to you about. If not, then the connection attempt is dropped, and there's really nothing else to it. Now, provided that we can make a connection here, authenticated connection, what will happen now is the Network's Access Protection Health Policy Server, which is an implementation of the Network Policy Server. There's a lot of different acronyms in all of this. But what that's going to do is it's going to identify what we call a system statement of health. You see, the NAP client out here, it's going to assemble a statement of health. And when you compile it all together, including all of its virus definitions that it has, the updates that it contains, the, malware protections that what goes ahead and involves, then it's going to combine all of that into the system statement of health, which it then sends to this server. This server here will compare it against what's required for the statement of health. And of course, if the client is sufficiently healthy and it meets all of our definitions, then the VPN connection continues on just as normal, and there's not really a whole lot of difference besides that. However, if the statement is not compliant, then what happens is this server will send back some remediation requirements to this client, and the client will have to meet those and satisfy those remediation requirements first. What will happen involved in that as well is a set of packet filters that will allow it to communicate only with certain servers. Normally that's going to be these remediation servers, and I kind of just generalized those here, but that could be an antivirus update, that could be a WSUS server, that could be some other kind of a anti-spyware, whatever it is. Okay, so it could be those types of servers would be our remediation servers. Based upon what the NPS server here sent back to the client will know what it needs to fix. Maybe it's got the proper antivirus definitions, but it's missing an update from WSUS. So it'll ignore the antivirus part because it never received instructions for that part, but it will request from the WSUS server the latest updates. And then once that happens, the client will then update its own SSOH, or its statement of health, system statement of health. Then it will send that back again to this server over here. This time, of course, it's going to be up to date, and then it will be able to complete the VPN connection as usual. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of these other things here as well, just because I've got a couple of other items on here that you might want to know about. One of those is the health requirement server. Again, this, a lot of the specifics in here you don't even, I don't think, have to know for the 70-647, but just FYI, this is a server that's going to identify what the current system health state should be for whatever it is that you're trying to monitor. For example, again with antivirus, it'll track whatever the latest version of the antivirus signature files are for you. Then you'll have the HRA, or Health Registration Authority. I just abbreviated that. Well, Microsoft abbreviates all of these, but I abbreviated that into an acronym here because it didn't have space. But the Health Registration Authority, what it's going to do is it's going to run IIS, and it's going to obtain health certificates from a certificate authority. Now, that's not even pictured here because I'm kind of running out of space, although I guess I could put it out here, a CA. All of this has to be run with certificates, and that's how it validates that, the client validates that it's actually communicating with an authenticated party. And once a health certificate is issued to a client, it's also going to have to be a certificate involved in that to authenticate that it's getting it from an authenticated server. Then also, let's take a look at this here as well, this health policy server. Let's go into this. And as I look at NPS down here, just so you can get some kind of a grip on some of the kinds of things that they're looking at here. If I right-click on my Windows Security Health Validator, this is just the default. I haven't configured any of this. And if I go to the properties here, then you can see what happens if the System Health Validator is unable to do certain things, like it's not able to contact required services. What will happen, whether it's compliant or non-compliant? We're generally assume non-compliant for all of these things, because if something doesn't go through properly, we want it to be able to not make the connection to the full intranet the way it would otherwise be able to do. Now, what I wanted to show you here, though, and some of these explain themselves, is this configure button, and here's where you can kind of see where it'll identify whether or not things are up to date. And this is where you define, for Windows Vista clients, for example, I want the firewall to be enabled for all network connections. If that's true, then I'll leave this checked. Same with virus protection. Antivirus application is on, and it is up to date. How do we know it's up to date? Because we have our health requirement server, which will track that part of it for us. Other things we'll have here is, do I want my anti-spyware application on? Boy, I kept trying to think of that name earlier, and I kept stumbling over myself. I could not come up with the name anti-spyware. It must be old age getting to me or something. Anyway, we want to see whether or not that's turned on and up to date. And you can see all of those different kinds of things that we can keep track of. That's how we check the health of our clients. And then again, of course, if they are compliant, then we'll allow them to make the connection. Now here, as we talk about enforcement, it really is kind of a stronger word than it really sounds like it really needs to be. This is just the type of network access or communication that's being used to access NAP. There are 4 different main types that we can use. One of those is VPN enforcement, which, as you would guess, has an emphasis on remote clients. And that's what I want to point out to you with each one of these, is what the emphasis is for each one of these in terms of the importance for the 70-647 exam. So, of course, for remote clients, that's where we're mostly looking at here. Now, of course, you can use NAP inside of your own local area network without having any, VPN clients at all. Even when I come in at 8 o'clock in the morning or turn on my computer, okay, I'll be honest, it's actually 9 or 9:30. When I turn on my computer and get it started up, well, when it comes onto the network, I'm not using VPN, I'm just locally attached to my LAN. But I could still use NAP to check out the health of my system, and if I'm not in compliance, then it could send me into remediation. So I don't necessarily have to have a VPN in all cases. But for my remote clients, of course, that's what I would want. VPN enforcement does use constant monitoring, so that if I fall out of compliance for some reason, maybe there's a recent update that several of my clients have received, but I haven't, then I would fall out of compliance and I would have to go back into remediation. There's also another type of access, and that would be the DHCP method. With this one, our emphasis is just on access by addressing. Okay, this again could be a remote client, but it more likely would be a local client that they just turned on their computer. Through the discovery process, it's trying to get an IP address. Well, with NAP, what's going to happen here is it's going to grant an address, and by the way, this is also constantly monitored. It's going to grant an address, and if the computer is in compliance, then that address that it gets and all of its configuration is going to grant it full access. But if it's not in compliance and it has to be in a restricted network, for example, even temporarily, then the IP address configuration that it gets is only going to limit it to that narrow scope or that restricted network. Now, one thing to keep in mind with this, with DHCP enforcement, is it's really useful for simple configuration, but it's not very elaborate, and it's easy to override if someone has local administrator access. And a lot of users still do have administrative access on their local computers. The reason why it's not that secure is because they could configure a static address, which would then get them onto the main secured network. Now here I wanted to just quickly go back to my DC1 server and go to a group policy object, and you can see that I'm here. Let me actually go up a little bit. You can see that I'm in computer configuration policies, Windows settings, security settings, and then there's a lot of security settings that you can configure by policy under network access protection. In particular, I'm looking at the network access protection, enforcement clients here, and then here I would say IPsec relying party. So in my next topic, I'm going to be talking about IPsec policy, and we can enforce that by using this method here. And you also saw there that there was a DHCP enforcement method. Actually, let me go back there. There's a DHCP enforcement client method here as well. Now, since these are all clients, there's also these are ES enforcement, or they're EC enforcement clients, but there's also ES for enforcement server, which of course appears on your Windows Server 2008 server. They're kind of two halves of the same thing. And for our IPsec enforcement, you can can configure that using the policy that I just showed you. But here's the focus. The focus is on server and domain isolation. And the reason for that is because I can configure IPsec enforcement so that I only want domain members to make connections to my network. So if I try to make a connection, but my computer's not a member of the domain, then I will not be able to make the connection. So this is a big emphasis that I would definitely keep in mind for 70-647 emphasis. If you want to use or make sure that only domain members can connect, you would want to use IPsec as your enforcement method. There's also 802.1x enforcement. I forgot to write enforcement out there, but it's 802.1x enforcement as well. Here, the focus is on your method for accessing the network, whether it's wired or wireless access. And both of those will give me specific privileges to be able to make connections. So with 802.1x, for example, either way, whether I'm wired or wireless, once I've made my connection, I can force it to connect to only specific servers. Okay. Now, this is, again, different from some of the other ones. It's different from DHCP because it's not really a matter of getting an IP address, although I'll have one. It's not really a matter of IPsec enforcement because it doesn't matter whether I'm a domain member or not. I just want to know that when I connect, I'm only going to connect to specific servers here. And then this one also has constant monitoring, so that if I fall outside of scope there for some reason or out of compliance, then it will cause me to go back into remediation or whatever other specific instructions I've given it, and then it'll go through the whole NAP authentication cycle again until I'm reconnected properly. Another important emphasis, by the way, here with this 802.1x item is that it's not all configured in Windows. Some of this can be configured through various types of switches or network equipment, such that even once you've made the connection, then maybe that switch would connect you only to a VLAN or a specific port or a specific server. So that's why I say here, connect to specific servers, or I guess I could put out here as well, a specific VLAN, if I can write VLAN or something like that. In this nugget, we talked about network access. We started off by talking about perimeter networks, where we can, again, kind of get an idea for how we protect our internal protected network or secured network from the external world, such as the internet. We also took a look at VPN protocols, namely L2TP, PPTP, and then the new super sexy SSTP protocol. In fact, maybe we should just call it, instead of secure socket tunneling protocol, we should just call it super sexy tunneling protocol. Okay, so anyway, it was pretty cool because you don't have to open up an additional port on your firewall, and yet it's very secure. We took a look at network access policies, which is going to govern when, where, how. It's kind of like the reporter questions: when, where, what, how, whatever, that you can make a connection with. And then we also took a look at network access protection, which is a very important part of Windows Server 2008, but extremely complex as well. With network access protection, we can also govern which enforcement method we decide to use. Remember, we took a look at remote access, VPN connections, DHCP, IPsec, and 802.1x types of connections.